Okey-dokey. All right. Hey, friends. Welcome back to the Peace Now podcast, where we're bringing together trauma informed therapy, spirituality, and social justice activism. I am really excited today. I'm getting an opportunity to sit down with Mark Charles, who's been a big influence for me over the last couple of years and gracious enough to join us on the podcast. So, how are you doing today, Mark?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I wanted to ask, oh, this question we've been asking at the beginning on absorption. So, like in the last weeks, days, months, this last bit of life, what has been capturing your attention and absorbing you recently?
Well, before we get into that, let me introduce myself.
Okay,
I like
deal.
to introduce myself traditionally before I go into a public event. So yeah, hey, Mark Charles Yinashia, Sin Bakedana Nishla, Doto Higlini Bashichin, Sin Bakedana Dashicheda Chini Dashanella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we give our four clans. We're matrilineal, and so our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Tsin Beke Dene. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the Wooden Shoe people.
Hmm.
My second clan, my father's mother, is Tor Higlini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsin Beke Dene. And my fourth clan, my father's father, is Totochitni, which is the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I also want to acknowledge I'm speaking to you from what's now called Washington, D.C. I moved here from the Navajo Nation with my family about 9 years ago. And the DC area is the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And so I want to honor the Piscataway as the hosts of the lands where I'm living. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands and just want to state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. So the question you asked, what am I, how'd you frame it? What am I doing? What am I thinking about right now?
What's absorbing you
What's
in your time?
absorbing me?
Yeah.
I have several things that are absorbing me at the moment. One of them is I'm writing my second book. So the book you can see I wrote about 4 years ago. It's behind me. It's called Unsettling Truths, the Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. Myself and my good friend Singchan Ra, professor of religion at Fuller University, or at Fuller Seminary in Southern California, we wrote that book together. And my second book that I'm working on right now is called Decolonizing Faith.
Okay. Hmm.
And the first book, so Unsettling Truths, looked at the way that the church and nations misuse the scriptures to justify violence against marginalized people. So
Hmm.
whether it's the Promised Land theology and Manifest Destiny claimed by the United States that justify the ethnic cleansing and genocide of Native peoples, or whether it's the enslavement, history of enslavement that came from that same history that resulted in the oppression of people of color from Africa. And so we critiqued in that book the United States and the way it misappropriated and misused those scriptures. But we didn't look at the text of the scriptures themselves. We didn't critique the scriptures themselves. So in the book of Deuteronomy, God literally tells the people of Israel as they go into Canaan to take their promised lands that they're to kill everybody, every man, every woman, every child, every animal, to leave nothing left alive in the land. And so Unsettling Truths didn't critique that, but Decolonizing Faith is.
Great.
And so I am the best way I can describe it is I'll have to use the words of a good friend of mine whose name is Raymond Miniacon. He's Aboriginal from Australia, and when he was speaking at a conference a year ago here in the States, I met up with him and we had a chance to sit and talk. But in his conference, he laid out his presentation. He laid out the history of Aboriginal people with kind of the colonizers of Australia, very similar history to the US as far as what was happened, how it was all done in the name of the church.
Hmm.
And at the end of his presentation, he did a Q&A, and he was asked in the Q&A, and we all get asked this question, which is, why are you a Christian?
Hmm.
Like, if the Christian faith, the church did these horrific things to your people, why do you now follow that faith tradition? And his answer blew me away, because he said, the reason I'm a Christian is because that's who colonized us. If we had been colonized by Muslims, I'd be a Muslim. If we're colonized by Hindus, I'd be a Hindu. If we're colonized by Buddhists, I'd be a Buddhist. He said, I'm a Christian because that's who colonized us. And essentially, that's who put a gun to our head.
Mm-hmm.
He said, but today I'm interrogating my faith to find out if this faith tradition fully acknowledges my humanity as an Aboriginal man. And I spoke with him later. I said, why'd you use the word interrogate? Why not examine or investigate? And he said, because those words are too passive. He said, I'm literally putting this faith on trial to find out, does this acknowledge my full humanity as an Aboriginal man? And the bluntness of his answer and the honesty of his answer blew me away. And I realized that's exactly what I'm doing. That's what I was doing when I wrote Unsettling Truths. And that's what I'm doing as I'm writing this book, Decolonizing Faith, is I am interrogating. I've been a Christian all my life.
Yeah.
My grandparents are boarding school survivors. They became Christians in the boarding schools. My family has been a part of this faith tradition on my Navajo side, going back 4 generations now. And I realize, I'm like, we've never taken the opportunity to interrogate this faith, right? My grandparents worked for the missionaries their entire lives. They were always under their authority, under their auspices. They never had the room to interrogate what they were forced to believe.
Yeah.
And I grew up believing it and accepting it. And now I'm realizing, there's some questions I have. So I am actively now interrogating my faith.
Yes.
And trying to understand, what does it mean, and does it acknowledge my humanity as a Navajo man? So I've been working on this book. I've been pondering this book for a number of years. I've been actively working on it for about 7 to 9 months, probably. And I'm an extrovert, so I'm not an author who can just go sit in a library and write and come out with, I need to talk about this stuff. The book I wrote, Unsettling Truths, I was lecturing on that content for a decade before I wrote the book. And so I'm doing a lot of stuff. Some of it is online, some of it is in when I speak publicly, and a lot of it is on my Patreon, where I'm engaging this stuff on a monthly basis. And I'm basically building my arguments, teasing out my ideas, and kind of putting this stuff together. But I need to do it in almost a public or external way, because that's how my brain processes these things the best. And so that's what I've been doing for the past 8 months, is I've been thinking through the arguments of this book. I've been laying them out when I speak. I've been talking about them on social media. I've been discussing them at length and in depth on my Patreon site. And I'm very excited about this next year of actually now taking all these ideas and taking all these thoughts and putting them together into this new book that I'm writing.
Excellent. Yeah. And I hope people will go check those resources out, and then we'll be like anticipating the release of this, because it sounds like fascinating. So like, just so I'm hearing you. So the first text, it was really a critique and a look at how Christian scripture was used to like justify the oppression of people of color, both with slavery and then genocide of Native peoples. It's looking at that. And then this text is like building on that, but also interrogating the scripture itself, like almost the spirituality itself. Is that fair?
Yeah. So the first book was saying, how was the scriptures misused to justify these things? Now I'm saying, how do the scriptures themselves lend themselves to a violent and oppressive and colonial worldview?
Yeah.
So, for example, for people who understand, so the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, these books are accepted as scripture by 3 major religions. They're accepted by the Christian faith, they're accepted by the Jewish faith, and they're accepted by Islam, by the Muslim faith. All three of these are Abrahamic religions, and they see Abraham as one of the fathers of that faith. God, after being known as creator, is next known as the God of Abraham.
Yes.
In the book of Genesis. And so one of the things I'm looking at, just to give you an example. So in the Old Testament, you have this revelation of who God is. And it starts in the beginning of Genesis by defining God as creator. And then God gets defined as the God of Abraham. And then later, God gets defined as the God of Israel. And then in First Samuel, which is outside the Torah, but is in the Old Testament, God identifies as king.
Ah, yes.
And so what I find fascinating is as you see the progression of God being identified from creator, moving further away from being creator and closer to being king, you see a repeated pattern of God both enacting violence against nations and people, and ultimately God asking nations and people to enact violence on God's behalf.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a fascinating journey, right? Where you start with creator, where creator is a nurturing, caring divinity, but as it moves further away from creator, more into king, you see a very aggressive, violent, even abusive picture of who God is.
Mm.
And so this is one of the themes I'm examining in this book is what does it say about these faiths? So I do a podcast called My Second Cup of Coffee, and I get on YouTube several times a week and just drink my second cup of coffee and have a discussion about the things that are going on politically, socially, and religiously around the country. And about 2 months ago, I had a conversation about the war in Gaza.
Yes.
And I said, okay, we have three participants there. We have the United States, we have Israel, and we have Hamas. All three of these faiths are Abrahamic religions.
Mm.
All three of these
Wow.
nations have nationalized their faith. So the United States has nationalized Christianity, Israel has nationalized Judaism, and Hamas has nationalized Islam. And segments of these nations have used that nationalistic religion to justify incredible violence, whether it's acts of terror or oppression or enslavement or even genocide on behalf of the United States. Right? So all three of these nations have used their nationalized religions to justify extreme violence against their enemies. And I said, so we have all these discussions about how these three nations and these three faith traditions are so different. And I said, we should probably take a closer look at what they have in common.
Yes.
They're all Abrahamic religions. They all accept this narrative of God moving from creator towards king. They all celebrate these extreme violent acts of violence by God and on God's behalf. And so if we want to find a way to end the violence in the Middle East, we should look at the way these faiths are similar instead of the ways that they're different, instead of only focusing on the ways that they're different.
Yeah.
And so so this is all content that's being spurred by my writing this book and by my examining these topics of this process. The book I'm working title is Decolonizing Faith.
Yeah, decolonizing faith. And the first text is Unsettling Truths. And Mark, this analysis you have of what's going on in Palestine right now in the Middle East. It's really, I actually hadn't put that together yet. Yet, so the three Abrahamic religions nationalized. It's extremely insightful and a sharp analysis. And I'm wondering if this is a good segue into like your interesting work on trauma. And the reason is I want to say, if you could just indulge me a little, I'm going to try to process a little bit. I have been, along with your book, Unsettling Truths, I've been looking into Indigenous people's history of the United States.
Yeah.
And I find it very difficult to read, actually. I usually read very quickly, but it's really both texts. That's why I wasn't able to finish yours before our interview. And when you brought up in our pre-conversation trauma, it was actually it makes sense to me. It pinged with me. I think I was a bit, while reading this, a bit disassociated from the pain, because there's a lot of pain in these where you can feel it, even just vicariously through the authors, like you and the author. You can feel, if you're, I think if you're open to it, you can. I'm feeling it, and it's taking a toll. And I'm wondering, like, this sharp analysis that you have, and this inability for me to see that kind of point, the relationship between trauma and these things, and like how you have, I guess, how you have worked through some of this stuff, and you're able to kind of so eloquently and sharp and cold, not cold, but like you're able to see critically what's going on and just lay it out, even though it's so difficult. Like, can you riff on that a little bit?
Well, so the challenge is most people, they don't understand the role that trauma plays in the way these conversations play out. So when I say trauma, right, if I just say trauma, almost immediately everyone thinks of what's called PTSD, post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD, it's an individual diagnosis. It comes from a single horrifying event.
Yes.
It affects you mentally, physically, emotionally, relations, kind of this all-encompassing condition, but it's an individual diagnosis stemming from a single event. Okay. Now there's another trauma called a complex PTSD. A complex PTSD is also an individual diagnosis, but instead of coming from a single event, it comes from a series of events. So if you get PTSD from being assaulted, you get complex PTSD from living in an abusive relationship.
Mm-hmm.
If you get PTSD from being in a battle, you get complex PTSD from living in a war zone. Now, psychologists have observed that the symptoms of a complex PTSD are passed down generationally. They don't know quite how it happens, but they observe the symptoms in the children and grandchildren of the people who experience the complex trauma. So there's now a third trauma called HTR. HTR is known as historical trauma. Historical trauma is not an individual diagnosis. It's how psychologists understand the dissatisfaction in a broad community. It was first observed in Native communities after our history of boarding schools and residential schools. You can also see the same trauma, HTR, in African communities, African-American communities after Jim Crow, or segregation, or mass incarceration, or even enslavement. You can see it in Asian American communities after, Japanese American communities after internment camps, or you can see it in Jewish communities after the Holocaust, right? So I refer to historical trauma as a multi-generational communal manifestation of a complex PTSD, if that makes sense. So by understanding this trauma, when I go out to speak to audiences, especially as I talk to people of color or other marginalized audience, I can be aware of the trauma that's in the room, either on an individual level or on a corporate level, a PTSD, a complex PTSD, or historical trauma. And sometimes it could exist all in the same person. By understanding and being aware that trauma is there, I can be aware of what's going to trigger my audience. I can be aware of reactions from my audience. And it helps me both to prepare the audience and for myself to be prepared for the reactions or responses I might get. Now, the challenge is that the most disruptive audiences regarding issues of US history, and especially regarding race, is it's not people of color, it's white people. White people are the most disruptive demographic when it comes to dialogues about US history and about race. And I had observed what I called symptoms of trauma in my white audiences for a number of years, but I didn't know how to pinpoint it. I didn't know how to categorize it. It wasn't a PTSD, it wasn't a complex PTSD, it wasn't historical trauma, but I was observing symptoms of trauma. And I came across this book by Rachel McNair. It's called Perpetration-Induced Traumatic Stress. She's looking at what she calls the psychology of killing. So what she wanted to understand is, she wanted to know is, if society gives you the license to take a life, right? You're in law enforcement, you're a soldier, you're in certain aspects of the medical community, or maybe you're even just a good white guy at the mall with a gun, right? And society gives you the right in certain instances to take a life. She wanted to know, what does that do to you psychologically? She found it causes what she named a perpetration-induced traumatic stress, something which has all the symptoms of a PTSD, except a PTSD afflicts the victims of the horrifying event, whereas PITS afflicts the perpetrator, the person who caused it. And so once I had her research and I had her diagnosis of a perpetration-induced traumatic stress, I could now hypothesize that if PTSD had a multi-generational communal manifestation at a complex level, which we call historical trauma, which afflicts communities of color, might not PITS also have a multi-generational communal manifestation at a complex level, which was the trauma I was observing in my white audiences. And so I interact with white people as another group of traumatized people, right? So the first symptom of trauma is shock and denial, right? This explains so much about white America, why they're so adverse to things like critical race theory or the cancel culture or everything else, right? They've been remaining intentionally ignorant about this history that they're standing on, that their ancestors perpetrated, that is benefiting them, and they're remaining intentionally ignorant about it because it's horrifying what was done on their behalf. And that is, their response is not, so the challenge is in most dialogues about race, white people are put in one of two categories. Either they're racist or they're fragile, right? That's where we almost automatically put white people, whenever we talk about race, white people, either if they're entering the conversation, either you're racist or you're fragile. Now, those aren't necessarily the most helpful paradigms. If a white person is racist merely because they lack pigmentation in their skin, it means their presence in the dialogue is a threat, and anything they say has to be treated with as a threat, either defended against or go on the offense against. That also means they have no role in the conversation. That's not helpful. The other paradigm is white people are fragile, right? After the lynching of George Floyd in 2020, Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, shot to the top of the New York Times bestseller, stayed there for almost a year. Now, Robin has a lot of good insights into the psyche behind whiteness, but I struggle with her paradigm of fragility. Because if something's fragile, if I'm helping you move and you have a box marked fragile, I see the label on the box, I have one of two choices. I can heed the warning on the label and pick it up and place it gently into the truck, or I can ignore the label and say, oh, I saw Brian pack this, it's just towels in there, and I can throw it in the truck disregarding what was written on the side. Not knowing you put your china at the bottom of that box beneath the towels, which I've now broken because I've disregarded your label. So those are the two options when we deal with fragility, which, again, that's not helpful. And so what I find is, by treating my white audiences first and foremost as traumatized instead of as racist or fragile, it allows me to develop better tools to get them to hear the history, right? Now, I have to be very clear, white people are not victims of trauma. This is a perpetration-induced traumatic stress at a multi-generational, communal, and complex level. This is based on what they're standing on, what was done on their behalf, what they are actively benefiting from. They are not victims of trauma, but they are experiencing the history of what was done for them as you would experience any other trauma. and they're remaining in a state of shock and denial regarding that history. And so what I found is, by using the research by Rachel McNair, by hypothesizing about what that could be doing at a multi-generational, communal, and complex level, and by then creating tools to treat my white audiences as traumatized, I was actually able to lower the temperature of my white audiences in the room.
Yeah, fascinating, Mark. Yeah. This shifting into like a trauma pedagogy or something like with history, that yeah, you've been developing this and it's fascinating. I wanted to ask this. So, and you've been taking a lot of care with us too to kind of prime us and introduce us to and modeling some of these ideas that you're utilizing. I wanted to ask about history, like the focus is history in your practice. So like the value of the study of history, I guess. So like, how do you think, the question I was going to ask is, our country, so we're both coming out, it's now called the United States of America. We're both living and working here. Understanding our historical context, in particular treatment of indigenous people, people of color, and other marginalized communities. How does that study of that help us understand our current social fabric, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask in a long-winded way.
Well, I don't have the deep answer to this, but I mean, just knowing what I know about addiction and how addiction is meant to numb and is used to basically redirect emotional energy, or other things, or to keep things buried, right? If we have a nation that doesn't know how to acknowledge the genocide and enslavement that was done on its behalf, it's not surprising that and we've never dealt with that history. We've never wrestled with it. We've never looked at it and acknowledged it and owned it. It's no surprise, right, that we struggle with the issues of addiction that we have in our nation. I mean, you can see it very clearly in our communities of color, and we'll understand why our communities struggle with these things. But right, I mean, if you look at the whole opioid epidemic, right? The war on drugs, which was started by Reagan, which obviously was a war on race.
Yes.
Right. And if I actually did this research, if you look at the way we treated addiction in the 80s and 90s, when the majority of people dying from opioid addiction were people of color, we treated it as a criminal, a criminal issue, and we worked to incarcerate people. We criminalized drug use, is what we did. Now, in the late 90s, early 2000s, the number of opioid addictions in white people began rising.
Yes.
And in the late 90s, early 2000s, it actually caught up with the same rate as people of color. And then early 2000s, the rate of addiction and the rate of death by opioid overdose in white communities shot up, just spiked through the roof. And this is exactly the very same time that we begin changing our stance towards addiction.
Yeah.
We're now, instead of treating addiction as a criminal act, now we're treating it as the mental health crisis that it actually is, right? And we actually begin developing things so we could save lives on the street instead of just letting people die. But again, we didn't realize this was a problem until it started affecting our white citizens of this country. And so, right, so when you look at the deep level of addiction that our nation struggles with, and the way we are absolutely ignorant about our history, to me, it makes perfect sense why we have the levels of addiction that we do in our country. It makes perfect sense, right? There's things we don't know how to talk about. We don't know what to deal with, know what to do with. We don't know how to emotionally deal with what we've done as a nation. I mean, in our book, Unsettling Truths, two of the hardest chapters to read are the two chapters just before the trauma chapter. The trauma chapter is chapter 11.
Mhm.
The two hardest chapters to read are chapters 9 and 10. In chapters 9 and 10, we deal with the adage that the victors write the history, right? So if you win a war, you get to write about this war. Now, this isn't controversial. This is broadly accepted, right? And so we help people to imagine at the beginning of chapter 9, right? Let's imagine had Nazi Germany won World War II. Just pretend.
Yeah.
How would their historians have treated the legacy of Hitler had they won the war? Well, he'd probably be their greatest leader ever, right? Had they won the war, how would their historians had treated the history of the Holocaust? Well, we have Holocaust deniers today. Imagine if they won the war, right? What Holocaust? There was no Holocaust, right? When the victors write the history, they get to basically frame what actually gets reported about the history, and they will often create mythology about it to cover up their own transgressions. Now, this is widely accepted, right? The victors write the history. What makes chapters 9 and 10 so difficult to read is not that adage. It's that we point out that the United States of America has never lost a war that matters. We've never been invaded. We've never given up large tracts of land. We've never been disarmed. We've never had a regime change. We've never borne the scorn of the global community. We've never lost a war that matters. Technically, the Korean War is still going on. We pulled out of Vietnam. We pulled out of Afghanistan, but we didn't lose anything there except a little bit of pride. We've never lost a war that matters, meaning we, and by we, I mean white people, have written their own history for 250 years. So we take the adage, the victors write the history, we take the understanding that the U.S. has never lost a war that matters, and we apply that to Abraham Lincoln. And chapters 9 and 10 conclusively demonstrate that Abraham Lincoln, not only was he a blatant, unapologetic, self-proclaimed white supremacist until the day he died, but he was also one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history.
Wow.
After chapters 9 and 10, I can easily compare Lincoln to Hitler, and nobody bats an eye.
Yes, nice. Yeah.
Once you see what he did, the policies he enacted, the ways that he was moving and what he was doing, it's very clear what his agenda was. And yet, because we've written our own history, we've made him not only our hero, we made him essentially a god. And so it's no mistake that in our book, the chapter on trauma comes right after the chapters on Abraham Lincoln, because the reason we don't know the truth about Lincoln is because we're so traumatized by what he did. And so this is where, as a nation, by and large, we don't know our own history. We don't understand what was done to build this nation. And most people don't. I lecture on Abraham Lincoln a lot. In fact, in 2024, I'm going to go nationally with a tour talking about Lincoln directly. And I tell people, right, the challenge with Lincoln is everybody knows Lincoln. Everybody loves Lincoln, right? Democrats and Republicans. The Republicans love to remind us that Lincoln, they're the party of Lincoln.
Yeah.
Right? President Obama, our nation's first Black president, was sworn into office with his hand on the Lincoln Bible. Right? Everybody knows Lincoln. Almost everybody loves Lincoln. And everybody knows enough about Lincoln to know that they shouldn't read the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They know there's some stuff in there they don't want to know.
Yeah.
And so they avoid it. We quote the Lincoln-Douglas debates extensively because if you don't understand the arguments he's making in those debates, you will never understand the policies he enacted when he was president. And so this is where the challenge of when the victors write the history and the victors are deeply traumatized by what they did, it literally creates mythology out of what our history was.
Yeah, deep mythology. It's a very evocative idea, placing Lincoln and Hitler right next to each other. It's, obviously just on a symbolic level, it's like, it's really opening for me. So yeah, I appreciate that. But then, yeah, this building from first principles, the victors write the history. Like, why wouldn't like, I think it's very logical and rational, even though it might be hard to hold emotionally, for some of the reasons you talk about trauma wise. I think what you said about addiction was so profound, Mark, on how this could be impacting. I don't know if you know, and I am so sorry to him. I hope to get him on the podcast, and I think I'm butchering his name, but his name is Don Koyhis. Don Koyhis is the initiator of the Wellbriety movement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he lectured, he spoke, he was a keynote at the National Association for Addiction Professionals this year, and he spoke on a bit of a different framing, but similar. Like, he used a root cause metaphor, and he had like addiction and violence against women and all these symptoms, homelessness, unhoused, all these symptoms that we care about. And then he was really looking at some of these root traumas of the land. And I found that to be like really rhyming with some of what you're saying. And then also, another point I wanted to make as you were talking, it escaped me briefly. Um, yeah, but the Lincoln mythology thing is super interesting. Maybe we can convince you to come to Pittsburgh and speak. I live in a neighborhood called Wilkinsburg, right outside of Pittsburgh,
Yeah.
and there was a battalion of Black soldiers who fought in the Civil War, and they're buried next to my house. I often walk around the cemetery where some of them are buried, and there's a statue to Lincoln. There's this mythological, and so the idea of him being a white supremacist and also venerated. I mean, it's pretty. I think it's something we should encounter and engage.
So let me just give you a small example, right? Because I know there are people who are listening. They're like, "Oh, he wasn't right. He was a good guy. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt."
Okay.
So in the Lincoln Douglas debates, in those debates, they weren't the soundbite things we have today, right? They were a series of 3 speeches. The first candidate spoke for about 20 minutes.
Yes.
The second candidate responded for about 30 to 40 minutes. And the first candidate came back and had a rebuttal for about 10 to 15 minutes. It was a series of 3 speeches. And in the Lincoln Douglas debates, right? So Lincoln was introducing himself at a national level. He was running for Senate in the state of Illinois. And most people knew he was against the institution of chattel slavery.
Mm-hmm.
But he needed to clarify. And so early in one of the debates, he said, "I have no intention of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people." He said there's a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the 2 races from living in terms of social and political equality. And as long as they must remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, believe that the superior position belongs to the white race. So those were his words. Now, this was in 1858, right? So you have to ask why. Why was Lincoln saying this so clearly in 1858 when it was known he was against chattel slavery? Well, a few years ago, during the midterm elections of 2022, we had a very pivotal Supreme Court case just before those elections, which was Roe versus Wade was overturned. And so everyone who ran for office had to take a position on a woman's right to choose, right? That was a central theme of that entire midterm election. Well, in 1857, there was another pivotal Supreme Court decision, which was the Dred Scott decision, which stated formerly enslaved peoples were not protected by our founding documents. And so the debate of the midterm elections of 1858 was, where do you stand on the civil rights of people of color? And Abraham Lincoln was making it crystal clear he supported the Dred Scott decision.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, and so bringing this to light, it's part of our work, examining history critically. And yeah, the potential of it is to, yeah, just really, I mean, I think as people were interested in trauma therapy, it's like, getting over the shock, maybe as some of us are feeling as our bubble has popped a little bit about Abraham Lincoln, and understanding, the meaning of, yeah, something about like it's sad because it means that like parts of this movement, for civil rights, politicians are again instrumentalizing people of color and using them for political purposes, and even people we deify and are putting up as heroes. I wanted to ask you though, because you're like such a student of history that's so clear, and you're able to see it through the trauma work you've done. You're able to kind of see it, and learn from it, or that's what it appears to me based on this conversation and some of the reading. What do you like? How would you self like? So you ran for president. That's where I heard about you. Like, how do you contextualize you yourself as like political philosophy wise? Like, so we've got like the progressive Democrats, right? And then we've got, you understand how Republicanism came out, and we've got like Marxism, social, we've got all these words. Like, can you contextualize your own thinking in what we might know?
So I work very hard to be independent.
Mhm.
Now, independent is actually the largest political party in our country,
Mhm.
but most people are not truly independent. They just don't want to commit to their party.
Mm.
So most independents lean left or lean right.
Yeah.
And they just don't want to commit early on. But most people generally lean left or right. One of the things that I work very hard to do, and so I tell this people all the time, one of the reasons why Unsettling Truths was not a New York Times bestseller is because we critique both sides.
No one likes it.
Right. And
Yeah.
so if we want a bestseller, and we could have written a bestseller, all we had to do would be to critique the right and celebrate the left, or vice versa, critique the left and celebrate the right. Right. That's all. If you want to have a bestseller, that's all you got to do. But we critique both sides. We looked at how both the Democrats and the Republicans have these foundational level values for racism, sexism, and white supremacy. And they both work very hard to hold them up.
Yes.
Online, I've given a TEDx talk. It's called We the People, the Three Most Misunderstood Words in U.S. History. I go through how the doctrine of discovery, going back all the way to 1823, gets referenced by the Supreme Court as the legal precedent for land titles, basically saying because natives aren't human, they don't have title to the land. They're just occupants of it. And Europeans who are white and fully human, they have the right of discovery to the land, so therefore they're the true title holders. That case in 1823 creates the legal precedent for land titles. That precedent and the doctrine of discovery get referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. In the 2005 case, the last time the doctrine of discovery was referenced by name by the court, it basically builds the exact same argument that John Marshall built in 1823. It doesn't use the word savages, but it basically says, yeah, we've civilized your land and you can't have it back. And that opinion was, I identify it. And if you actually watch my TEDx talk or read the book, you'll see it. I identify that as probably one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime. And it was written and delivered by Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Wow.
That's shocking for people because, right, her legacy was she was a voice of dissent on a conservative Supreme Court, fighting and speaking for the rights of the marginalized, which she was and which she did. But because land titles are literally based on the legal understanding that natives aren't human, this means white supremacy is a bipartisan value, which she clearly demonstrated in her opinion in 2005.
Mm. Yeah, I wasn't aware as much in my prep for this of your like kind of myth killing function, which I don't know if you like that term, but I'm just describing it like that. But I really like it. Just Mark, if you can, I like it because I'm gonna indulge in a little bit of biography now. Yeah, I'm 32 years old. So I was very caught up. Obama actually came to my high school and we canvassed for him.
Yeah,
And and at that time, as young people, were very radicalized by the war, the
yeah,
Iraq war. And he was very anti-war. And then that just flew out the window, like on day one, the Guantanamo Bay wasn't closed. And like we were very hurt. And many of my friends did go to the right or become drastically depoliticized because of that. And so I get very cranky when people, raise Obama up on a pedestal because I just feel that, aesthetically he's beautiful, he's funny, he's charming, but just the facts of his campaign are absolutely brutal, or his, in my opinion.
yeah.
So I appreciate the function, the realness. I do appreciate it.
If you read, right, I mean, if you read President Obama's book, right, The
Mhm,
Promised Land,
mhm,
his entire strategy to become president was to win Iowa, the caucuses in Iowa. Iowa is, I think it's the fifth whitest state in the country. And Iowa has the highest percentage of private lands of any state in the country.
mhm,
Retail politics is how you win Iowa. You have to shake everybody's hand. And so he had to convince white people that he was safe. Because as a black man, he's a threat, right?
yeah.
And so he was adamant. He says this in his book. He was not going to be the black president. Had he ran as the black president, he never would have gotten through Iowa.
Mm,
Right. This is the other reason I ran as independent, because our first caucuses in Iowa, our first primaries in New Hampshire. I already said, well, Iowa, New Hampshire is like the third whitest state in the country. They have the highest rate of home ownership.
yeah. Wow. That's
So
probably no surprise, huh?
if you want to get on the ballot nationally for president, you have to spend a year getting the approval of white landowning men in Iowa and New Hampshire.
So, Mark, you mentioned land owning men. So, like a lot of our conversation and the work we've you've done and we've discussed are around, white supremacy, this structure. What do you make of capitalism, like the link between capitalism? I know it's a big question and we're almost at the end. How do you relate to capitalism as an economic system?
I don't even have the space to begin going into that.
Okay.
I mean, the challenge with capitalism, right, is it assumes uninhibited growth,
Yes.
and that's not sustainable. Just the laws of nature.
Hmm.
It's not sustainable. And so we have some, now I don't deny that capitalism has corrected some injustices, or at least made them a bit more palatable, or a little less dangerous. I don't know which way to phrase it, the positive or the negative. But it's based on the assumption of unlimited growth.
Mm.
And that defies the laws of nature. And so we have to find a way. I said this during my campaign when I was running, right? Is the challenge with the United States of America is our lifestyle is not sustainable. We're like 1/20th of the world's population, and we consume like a fifth of the world's resources.
Yeah.
If the entire world consumed like the average, not even the billionaires, like the average American, we would be out of our renewable resources every year by like March or something, or April. So we have to recognize that this system we've built has created an economic system that is absolutely not sustainable. And we have to begin talking in some very real ways about not just how do we have better energy sources, but how do we actually begin to lower our consumption? How do we begin to actually lay out the expectation of we don't need to conserve more, we need to consume less?
Yeah, and I wonder, like, I wonder what you think of this formulation that I have, my thought process is the way I think of it is like, it's almost like the white supremacy is reinforcing this because it's like if we can extract the life force and the labor from this group of people, we can live this fantasy unsustainable for longer, basically. Would you kind of just broadly kind of agree with that formulation?
Well, and so that's the problem, as I tell people, and I say this in my speaking as well, is that the construct of whiteness
Mhm.
is not sustainable because it's dependent
Yes.
upon the oppression of people beneath it. And so whiteness cannot exist without oppressing someone beneath it. Because whiteness is an elevated sense of identity or even humanity.
Yeah.
And so I do this on my social media all the time, right? We've all been aware of the conversation, Black Lives Matter, Native Lives Matter. We have to say this. Probably at least once a year on my social media, I'll put this out there. White people are not superior. Because that's the underlying lie, right? The challenge is if this is where people are, or this is the plane of humanity right here, and we put people of color down here and white people up here. Yes, we need to raise up people of color and treat them as human. We also have to bring down white people to the plane of humanity. And so saying things like Black Lives Matter elevates this, but it doesn't address the lie of white supremacy. So we have to tell white people, you're not superior. You're human, just like the rest of us. Now, oftentimes when you say this to white, I've been accused of being racist because I said white people aren't superior, right? Because when you're used to being treated as more than, being treated as equal is going to feel oppressive.
Yeah.
But this is where Black Lives Matter, Native Lives doesn't go far enough because yes, it addresses, we have to elevate the humanity of people from the margins, but it doesn't address the way we have to lower the understanding of the people at the top.
Absolutely.
And if we can't do that, because up here is not sustainable. To be up here requires the oppression of people down here. But it also means that up here, where white people are, is not the enviable position. It's not where we should aspire to be because it's not a sustainable location.
Yes.
And so, yes, we have to lift up people in the margin. We also have to lower white people to the same equal plane of humanity where we can now interact as co-inhabitants of this world.
Yeah, in a relational sense.
Yes.
Love that. Very, very interesting. And so I'm not a journalist, I'm like a podcast host, so this isn't like a gotcha or anything, but I was moved to ask, will you run for president again?
I made the decision I'm not going to run in 2024.
Okay.
Primarily because when I ran, and I'll say this bluntly, I'm not famous enough. When I ran in 2020, if there was an award for the best announcement video, we probably would have won hands down. Yeah, I had people emailing me in tears who watched our announcement video and said, this is the most moving thing I've ever seen politically in my life. But the challenge we faced in that campaign was the best strategy to defeat me was to ignore me.
Yes.
And I was amazed at not only how the other candidates ignored me, but how the press ignored me. I would literally be written out of events. My press team would call the press and say, hey, you didn't mention Mark was at this event. And they say, yeah, we only cover Democrats and Republicans. We're not going to write you in. I was amazed at how they wrote us out of the event. And so the best way to deal with me was to ignore me. I wasn't famous enough to even be attacked. And so as I'm watching the 2024 election, right, it's the same participants. It's going to be Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, right? And it was interesting. So right now, Cornel West is running.
Yes.
First, he was in the People's Party, and then the Green Party, and now I think he's running as an independent. But he's primarily running on the left. He's a liberal. He's running on the left. And there was a few weeks ago, there was an article in one of the major newspapers, or one of the major publications, I forget which one, but they were asking the Biden administration or the Biden campaign about their strategy for Cornel West, and their literal strategy was to ignore him. That was what they were going to do. Now, Cornel West has a much bigger platform than I have. And so it was striking to me that, yeah, even he is getting ignored. And he has millions of followers. And so when I thought about 2024 running again, I thought, my platform hasn't grown enough since the last election. If I ran again, even if I had different ideas or changes to my platform, because I'm not well known enough, I could still just be ignored, and the campaign would probably have the very same result. So I'm waiting to run again until I'm at least famous enough to be attacked.
Okay, so when we see the first attack videos coming out,
that's my goal. So once I could start getting attacked, and not just like by the people on the fringe, but like once I actually enter into the national dialogue and people are saying, yeah, we can't talk about this, we got to ignore it or whatever, then I'm like, okay, now we can think about running again, because now people actually have to deal with us and not just ignore us. Yeah. And so that's why I made the intentional decision to not run in 2024, because I'm like, I'm not famous enough.
Yeah. Yeah. And if we just keep interviewing you and we can tell the truth about Abraham Lincoln and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Barack Obama, eventually they'll start attacking, we hope, and then we can have you run again. And I want to thank you, Mark, for this really thought-provoking, incisive interview. It's really lighting me up. It's given me a lot more to think on and a lot to read. I'm sure the audience as well. I'd like to ask as a final question, we got a little bit about it. So let me just summarize it. I'll pick out the things I think. Like, we want to go to your Patreon. We want to check out your second coffee of the day work.
My second cup of coffee is what I call it.
Second cup of coffee. We want to help grow your platform and help you get attacked so we can see you again run for president.
My goal isn't to be attacked. I just want to be big enough so that they have to deal with me. Yes, but gotcha.
Yeah. How can we help you with that or outside of that? We want to help your work and help you spread this. So how can we do that?
Yeah, so really the best way to do this is I'm on almost all the social media platforms. I'm on X, I'm on Threads, I'm on Facebook, I'm on YouTube, I'm on all the major platforms out there. I'm on LinkedIn. But I have a Patreon, and I intentionally decided not to monetize my platform on other social media sites, because if advertisers are advertising on my social media based on things I'm saying, that gives them even the tiniest amount of influence over what I do and do not say.
Yes.
So YouTube still advertises on my videos, but I've never monetized it, so I'm not getting any money from that. And that way I am working as hard as I can to keep my voice as independent as possible. And so I chose to use Patreon. I've been on Patreon for about a year. Actually 2 years now, I think I've been on Patreon. And it's the best way where people can get access to almost everything I create. You get ad-free versions of all of my second cups of coffee, any videos I produce or things I put out there. Plus, you get more in-depth engagement about things that I'm doing and where I'm traveling to, and even some audio of events that I'm at. And so I highly recommend people and encourage people to support my work by following me or subscribing to my account on Patreon. Also, I'm doing everything I can to engage the dialogue around the book I had already written on Selling Truth. So people on my website at wirelesshogan.com, and that's my username on almost every social media is wirelesshogan. And it's also my website, wirelesshogan.com. But on my website, you can buy signed copies of my book. So it's Wireless Hogan, all one word, wirelesshogan.com. And you forgot the W there, I think.
My keyboard lost its W.
Oh, okay. And so on here you can buy signed copies of On Selling Truth. And the other thing that I have there, so that supports my work directly. I also have what's called my book study special, where if someone buys 10 copies of my book, signed copies of my book from my website, for the purpose of a book study, I will give their study anytime over the next year a free virtual Q&A with me.
Great.
And so what it does is it allows groups to buy my book from my website. That money that goes into my pocket, and they can study the book, and then either the beginning, the middle, or the end of their study, they can schedule a Q&A with me, and I'll jump online for 45 minutes and do a virtual Q&A with that group. I do almost one of these a week. I love these conversations.
Nice.
And they're one of the best ways I've found to keep the dialogue going around the work I'm trying to do. So yeah, so that's probably the best way. So follow me on online. My second cup of coffee is available on YouTube. I stream to YouTube and Facebook, and then it's archived on YouTube. And then I also put it out as a podcast. The audio, I put it out after I record it out directly as a podcast, so they can also get it there. But
Right.
if you want ad-free versions of all those things, I put ad-free versions of all of that up on my Patreon. And I also engage deeper there. I have a decolonizing faith tier on my Patreon, where once a month I go in and talk with my patrons about content from my upcoming book. It's one of the places I use to kind of just engage more publicly about what I'm writing as I think through my argument and the stuff I'm putting into my book.
Lovely. This is excellent. We would definitely be taking advantage of that book study thing. We're starting one in 2024, so we'll definitely take you up on that, Mark. That it's really exciting. And yeah, I hope everyone will put this at the beginning too. I'll do a little blurb in the recorded version, and I'll throw it. Folks watching now, I was screen sharing, so you can Google it yourself, but we'll also have it somewhere around you where you can click. And Mark, again, I just wanted to say thanks so much for doing this. This has been a real privilege for me, and really honored that you'd come on the show.
Well, thank you very much. It's been fun to talk with you. And yeah, I look forward to future engagement.
Yeah, and we get to do this on the winter solstice. I just remember too.
Yeah, today's the first day of winter, shortest day of the year. So after tomorrow, the sun starts rising just a little bit later. So
yes,
I love this time.